nigga like me, man, I love the game. I love the hustle, man. I be feeling like one of them ball-playing niggas, you know, like Bird or Magic or something. Yeah, you know, a nigga got dough. A nigga could leave the league. But if I leave, the fans still gonna love me, man? I get love out here in Harlem, man. I done sold coke on these streets, man. Hash, weed, heroin. As long as niggas is feeling it, a nigga like me can hustle it. That's my gift in life, eh? You know? What? The fuck you laughing at, B?
You, man. Funny, man. You a hustling motherfucker, man. For real, baby. You fucking killing me, man.
Well, you know me, baby.
What up? It's your boy. Although this video is somewhat long, it's not gonna really be a lot of me talking on this video. But what I wanted to do, I've mentioned the book, The Outliers, a few times. And what I'm gonna do is probably from time to time, I'm gonna put a few chapters from different audio books that I like and explain certain things so they'll kind of bolster my videos and the point of views that I share. But The Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and I mean, he's a flaming liberal. I hate, you know, I'm not a liberal at all. But what I do like about his video is he does go through factual data. And he, in this book, denies the whole idea that people are born with a certain, you know, level of either intelligence or giftedness to the point. He doesn't deny gifts. He does acknowledge that people have gifts, but what he's denying is that is the sole reason for their success. He always, and there are different, you can Google the term 10,000 hours. I've mentioned this in a few other videos. 10,000 hours is what he basically came to. And there's the guy Tone Talks who talked about, Tone Talks actually mentioned that people think Bill Gates is from Compton. Bill Gates' father is one of the wealthiest attorneys in Seattle. He came from a well-to-do home, this, that. So that is why he thinks that Bill Gates is Bill Gates. Never mind that Bill Gates, and I don't think he's gonna, I'm not gonna put that chapter in it. You know what, I might just put all that in here. But the point I'm trying to make is this. The reason Bill Gates is Bill Gates is because people don't know that Bill Gates was born in the 50s, in the mid 50s. And he's gonna talk about that. And I wasn't gonna talk about that in this actual, I wasn't gonna put that segment in here, but I guess I'm gonna have to now. But basically, Bill Gates is pretty much a guy who was placed into a situation where he was able to get upwards of 10,000 hours of coding and programming on a computer. And he was able to get that all throughout college and all that because he, you know, at a time where in early 1970, think about it, computers were the size of like whole rooms. And to code literally would take you an hour. Like one of the founders, I think his name is Bill Joy, one of the guys who created Sun Microsystems. I think they created Java, if I'm not mistaken. But Sun Micro, one of their founders, would literally go and spend hours upon hours coding. He loved coding. He liked doing it. He got exposure to the code. See, it's one thing, and the point I'm trying to make is this. It's one thing for us to pass things off as white privilege. It is. And I believe there is a such thing as white privilege. I do think white people are afforded a certain level of treatment that blacks don't get. However, that's not the short of it. That's not the end all be all. See, what it is, black people, if you take the time to code, if you take the time to you know, play basketball, and I'm a living witness to the basketball aspect. I played basketball sun up, sun down. I did, and I was able to make a college team. Now I rode the bench, but I outworked everybody. And there were guys that were way better than me in elementary school, right? And not elementary school, I mean junior high, And even high school, there were guys that were better than me, right? And I would ride the bench and they would make little dirty comments about how I wasn't, you know. There's a book I did about black people. I mean, a book, video I did about people gambling on sports, playing the lottery for sports. Go check that. I think it's like one of my earlier videos. But the point I'm trying to make is this. People that were way ahead of me, I just outworked them. I just worked and worked. I knew guys that could shoot from half court, that could stand still and dunk the ball in the 7th grade, that could dribble left hand, right hand. They had the triple threat down. They were playing way better than I could by the 7th grade. I couldn't play. And I would go away, and by the time I got to junior college and started playing and came back and would run across these guys for Christmas break or they'll be home, it would be like night and day. Like I could see the fear in their eyes because they couldn't check me anymore. And it wasn't because they had been, you know, they just hadn't put the work in, man. I worked on my game, which is something a lot of people in the hood don't do. They just play pickup. So the point I'm trying to make is you can't just play ball and think that's just that. You have to play ball with a purpose. You have to be more That's why Kobe is one of the greatest players to ever play the game. Kobe is very purposeful with what he does. He is. As people say what they want about LeBron James, and I'm not a big LeBron fan. LeBron James is very purposeful about certain aspects of his life and his game, his diet. So he is where he is because he put the time and effort in to be where he is. I'll give him that. You know, Michael Jordan is the GOAT, greatest of all time, because Michael Jordan is you know, been discussed by many a sports aficionado that Michael Jordan put tons and tons of time in working on his game. So for us as black people, we need to, you know, what are you going to put those 10,000 hours towards? You know, say what you will about Bill Gates, right? And in the clip, Malcolm Gladwell's going to talk about Bill Gates was in the right place at the right time. Well, I'm going to tell you like this. Let's say you were in the right place at the right time, but your ass ain't put the 10,000 hours in of coding. You'll be the damn janitor. Okay? You're not going to be able to partake in these opportunities. If you really want to get in the position so that when the times or when the winds of opportunity blow, are you able to set your sails up and catch that wind and sail on into success? Or are you going to sit there and, well, the only reason he got there is because he's white? Like, get the fuck out of here. Like, that's one thing I will not tolerate. I might lose some subs from saying this, but please, before you unsubscribe, listen to this video by Malcolm Gladwell. I'm going to put up, it's probably going to be an hour and a half. I don't really do videos that long, but I'm going to have to put all the videos together and let it play for like an hour and some change. It's probably going to take a while. So I just wanted to put this out there so you guys will know. But just understand, people, we're not weaklings. We don't belong at, you know, at the effect of others.
Chapter 2, the 10,000-hour rule. In Hamburg, we had to play for 8 hours. The University of Michigan opened its new computer center in 1971 in a brand new building on Beale Avenue in Ann Arbor, with beige brick exterior walls and a dark glass front. The university's enormous mainframe computers stood in the middle of a vast white room, looking, as one faculty member remembers, like one of the last scenes in the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. Off to the side were dozens of key punch machines, what passed in those days for computer terminals. In 1971, this was state-of-the-art. The University of Michigan had one of the most advanced computer science programs in the world, and over the course of the computer center's life, thousands of students passed through that white room, the most famous of whom was a gawky teenager named Bill Joy. Joy came to the University of Michigan the year the computer center opened. He was 16. He was tall and very thin, with a mop of unruly hair. He had been voted most studious student by his graduating class at North Farmington High School outside of Detroit, which, as he puts it, meant that he was a no-date nerd. He had thought he might end up as a biologist or a mathematician, but late in his freshman year, he stumbled across the computing center, and he was hooked. From that point on, the computer center was his life. He programmed whenever he could. Joy got a job with a computer science professor so he could program over the summer. In 1975, Joy enrolled in graduate school at the University of California at Berkeley. There he buried himself even deeper into the world of computer software. During the oral exams for his PhD, he made up a particularly complicated algorithm on the fly that, as one of his many admirers has written, so stunned his examiners that one of them later compared the experience to Jesus confounding his elders. Working in collaboration with a small group of programmers, Joy took on the task of rewriting Unix, which was a software system developed by AT&T for mainframe computers. Joy's version was very good. It was so good, in fact, that it became, and remains, the operating system on which literally millions of computers around the world run. If you put your Mac in that funny mode where you can see the code, Joy says, I see things that I remember typing in 25 years ago. And when you go online, do you know who wrote much of the software that allows you to access the internet? Bill Joy. After graduating from Berkeley, Joy co-founded the Silicon Valley firm Sun Microsystems, which was one of the most critical players in the computer revolution. Then he rewrote another computer language, Java, and his legend grew still further. Among Silicon Valley insiders, Joy is spoken of with as much awe as someone like Bill Gates of Microsoft. He is sometimes called the Edison of the Internet. As the Yale computer scientist David Galertner says, Bill Joy is one of the most influential people in the modern history of computing. The story of Bill Joy's genius has been told many times, and the lesson is always the same. Here was a world that was the purest of meritocracies. Computer programming didn't operate as an old boy network where you got ahead because of money or connections. It was a wide open field in which all participants were judged solely by their talent and their accomplishments. It was a world where the best men won, and Joy was clearly one of those best men. It would be easier to accept that version of events, however, if we hadn't just looked at hockey and soccer players. Theirs was supposed to be a pure meritocracy as well, only it wasn't. It was a story of how the outliers in a particular field reached their lofty status through a combination of ability, opportunity, and utterly arbitrary advantage. Is it possible the same pattern of special opportunities operate in the real world as well? Let's go back over the story of Bill Joy and find out. For almost a generation, psychologists around the world have been engaged in a spirited debate over a question that most of us would have considered settled years ago. The question is this: is there such a thing as innate talent? The obvious answer is yes. Not every hockey player born in January ends up playing at the professional level. Only some do, the innately talented ones. Achievement is talent plus preparation. The problem with this view, though, is that the closer psychologists look at the careers of the gifted, the smaller the role innate talent seems to play, and the bigger the role preparation seems to play. Exhibit A in this argument is a study done in the early 1990s by the psychologist K. Anders Ericsson and two colleagues at Berlin's elite Academy of Music. With the help of the Academy's professors, they divided the school's violinists into three groups. In the first group were the stars, the students with the potential to become world-class soloists. In the second were those judged to be merely good. In the third were students who were unlikely to ever play professionally and who intended to be music teachers in the public school system. All of the violinists were then asked the same question. Over the course of your entire career, ever since you first picked up the violin, how many hours have you practiced? Everyone from all three groups started playing at roughly the same time, around the age of 5. In those first few years, everyone practiced roughly the same amount, about 2 or 3 hours a week. But around the age of 8, real differences started to emerge. The students who would end up as the best in their class began to practice more than everyone else, 6 hours a week by age 9, 8 hours a week by age 12, 16 hours a week by age 14, and up until by the age of 20, they were practicing, that is, purposefully and single-mindedly playing their instruments with the intent to get better, well over 30 hours a week. In fact, by the age of 20, the elite performers had totaled 10,000 hours of practice over the course of their lives. By contrast, the merely good students had totaled 8,000 hours, and the future music teachers had totaled just over 4,000 hours. Erickson and his colleagues then compared amateur pianists with professional pianists. The same pattern emerged. The amateurs never practiced more than about 3 hours a week over the course of their childhood, and by the age of 20 had totaled 2,000 hours of practice. The professionals, on the other hand, steadily increased their practice time every year until by the age of 20 they had reached 10,000 hours. The thing about Erickson's study is that he and his colleagues couldn't find any naturals, musicians who floated effortlessly to the top while practicing a fraction of the time their peers did. Nor could they find any grinds, people who worked harder than everyone else, yet just didn't have what it takes to break into the top ranks. Their research suggested that once you have enough ability to get into a top music school, the thing that distinguishes one performer from another is how hard he or she works. That's it. And what's more, the people at the very top don't just work much harder than everyone else, they work much, much harder. This idea that excellence at a complex task requires a critical minimum level of practice surfaces again and again in studies of expertise. In fact, researchers have settled on what they believe is the magic number for true expertise, 10,000 hours. The emerging picture from such studies is that 10,000 hours of practice is required to achieve the level of mastery associated with being a world-class expert in anything. Writes the neurologist Daniel Levitan. In study after study of composers, basketball players, fiction writers, ice skaters, concert pianists, chess players, master criminals, and what have you, this number comes up again and again. 10,000 hours is equivalent to roughly 3 hours a day or 20 hours a week of practice over 10 years. Of course, this doesn't address why some people get more out of their practice sessions than others, but no one has yet found a case in which true world-class expertise was accomplished in less time. It seems that it takes the brain this long to assimilate all that it needs to know to achieve true mastery. This is true even of people we think of as prodigies. Mozart, for example, famously started writing music at 6. But, according to the psychologist Michael Howe in his book Genius Explained, by the standards of mature composers, Mozart's early works are not outstanding. The earliest pieces were probably written down by his father and perhaps improved in the process. Many of Wolfgang's childhood compositions, such as the first 7 of his concertos for piano and orchestra, are largely arrangements of works by other composers. Of those concertos that only contain music original to Mozart, the earliest that is now regarded as a masterwork, number 9, K271, was not composed until he was 21. By that time, Mozart had already been composing concertos for 10 years. The music critic Harold Schoenberg goes further. Mozart, he argues, actually developed late, since he didn't produce his greatest work until he had been composing for over 20 years. To become a chess grandmaster also seems to take about 10 years. Only the legendary Bobby Fischer got to that elite level in less than that time. It took him 9 years. And what's 10 years? Well, it's roughly how long it takes to put in 10,000 hours of hard practice. 10,000 hours is the magic number of greatness. Here is the explanation for what was so puzzling about the rosters of the Czech and Canadian national sports teams. There was virtually no one on those teams born after September 1st, which doesn't seem to make any sense. You'd think that there should be a fair number of Czech hockey or soccer prodigies born late in the year who are so talented that they eventually make their way into the top tier as young adults. But to Erickson and those who argue against the primacy of talent, that isn't surprising at all. That late-born prodigy doesn't get chosen for the All-Star team as an 8-year-old because he's too small, so he doesn't get the extra practice. And without that extra practice, he has no chance at hitting 10,000 hours by the time the professional hockey teams start looking for players. And without 10,000 hours under his belt, there is no way he can ever master the skills necessary to play the top level. Even Mozart, the greatest musical prodigy of all time, couldn't hit his stride until he had his 10,000 hours in. Practice isn't the thing you do once you're good. It's the thing you do that makes you good. The other interesting thing about that 10,000 hours number, of course, is that 10,000 hours is an enormous amount of time. It's all but impossible to reach that number by the time you're a young adult all by yourself. You have to have parents who encourage and support you. You can't be poor because if you have to hold down a part-time job on the side to help make ends meet, there won't be enough time left over in the day to practice. In fact, most people can only really reach that number if they get into some kind of special program, like a hockey all-star squad, or they get some kind of extraordinary opportunity that gives them a chance to put in those hours. So, back to Bill Joy. It's 1971. He's tall and gawky and 16 years old. He's the math whiz, the kind of student that schools like MIT or Caltech or the University of Waterloo attract by the hundreds. When Bill was a little boy, he wanted to know everything about everything way before he should have even known what he wanted to know. His father, William, says, "We answered him when we could, and when we couldn't, we would just give him a book." When it came time to apply to college, Joy got a perfect score on the math portion of the Scholastic Aptitude Test. It wasn't particularly hard, he says, matter-of-factly. There was plenty of time to check it twice. He has talent by the truckload. But that's not the only consideration. It never is. The key to his development is that he stumbled across that nondescript building on Beale Avenue. In the early 1970s, when Joy was learning about programming, computers were the size of rooms. A single machine, which might have less power and memory than your microwave now has, could cost upwards of $1 million. And that's in 1970s dollars. Computers were rare. If you found them, they were hard to get access to. And if you managed to get access, renting time on them cost a fortune. What's more, programming itself was extraordinarily tedious. This was the era when computer programs were created using cardboard punch cards. Each line of code was imprinted on the card using a key punch machine. A complex program might include hundreds, if not thousands, of these cards in tall stacks. Once a program was ready, you walked over to whatever mainframe computer you had access to and gave the stack of cards to an operator. Since computers could only handle one task at a time, the operator made an appointment for your program, and depending how many people were ahead of you in line, you might not get your cards back for a few hours or even a day. And if you made even a single error, even a typographical error in your program, you had to take the cards back, track down the error, and begin the whole process again. Under those circumstances, it was exceedingly difficult for anyone to become a programming expert. Certainly becoming an expert by your early 20s was all but impossible. When you can only program for a few minutes out of every hour you spend in the computer room, how can you ever get to 10,000 hours of practice? Programming with cards, one computer scientist from that era remembers, did not teach you programming. It taught you patience and proofreading. It wasn't until the mid-1960s that a solution to the programming problem emerged. Computers were finally powerful enough that they could handle more than one appointment at once. If you rewrote the computer's operating system, computer scientists realized, the machine's time could be shared. It could be trained to handle hundreds of tasks at the same time. That, in turn, meant that programmers didn't have to physically hand their stack of computer cards to the operator anymore. You could build dozens of terminals, link them all to the mainframe by a telephone line, and have everyone working online all at once. Here is how one history of the period describes the advent of time-sharing. This was not just a revolution, it was a revelation. Forget the operator, the card decks, the wait. With time-sharing, you could sit at your teletype, bang in a couple of commands, and get an answer then and there. Time-sharing was interactive. A program could ask for a response, wait for you to type it in, act on it while you waited, and show you the result, all in real time. This is where Michigan came in, because Michigan was one of the first universities in the world to switch over to timesharing. By 1967, a prototype of the system was up and running. By the early 1970s, Michigan had enough computing power that 100 people could be programming simultaneously in the computer center. In the late 60s, early 70s, I don't think there was anywhere else that was exactly like Michigan. Mike Alexander, who was one of the pioneers at Michigan in setting up the university's computer system, said, "Maybe MIT, maybe Carnegie Mellon, maybe Dartmouth. I don't think there were any others." This was the opportunity that greeted Bill Joy when he arrived on the Ann Arbor campus in the fall of 1971. He hadn't chosen Michigan because of its computers. He had never done anything with computers in high school. He was interested in math and engineering and biology. But when the programming bug hit him in his freshman year, he found himself, by the happiest of accidents, in one of the few places in the world where a 17-year-old could program all he wanted. Do you know what the difference is between the computing cards and time-sharing, Joy says? It's the difference between playing chess by mail and speed chess. Programming wasn't an exercise in frustration anymore. It was fun. I lived in the North Campus, and the computer center was in the North Campus, Joy went on. How much time did I spend there? Oh, a phenomenal amount of time. It was open 24 hours. I would stay there all night and just walk home in the morning. In an average week in those years, I was spending more time in the computer center than in my classes. All of us down there had this recurring nightmare of forgetting to show up for class at all, of not even realizing we were enrolled. The challenge was that they gave all the students an account with a fixed amount of money, so your time would run out. When you signed on, you would put in how long you wanted to spend on the computer. They gave you like an hour of time. That's all you'd get, he said, laughing at the memory. But someone figured out that if you put in time equals and then a letter, like T equals K, they wouldn't charge you. It was a bug in the software. You could put in T equals K and sit there forever. Just look at the stream of opportunities that came Bill Joy's way. Because he happened to go to a far-sighted school like the University of Michigan, he was able to practice on a time-sharing system instead of punch cards. Because the Michigan system happened to have a bug in it, he could program all he wanted. Because the university was willing to spend the money to keep the computer center open 24 hours, he could stay up all night. And because he was able to put in so many hours, by the time he happened to be presented with the opportunity to rewrite Unix, he was up to the task. Bill Joy was brilliant. He wanted to learn. That was a big part of it. But before he could become an expert, someone had to give him the opportunity to learn how to be an expert. At Michigan, I was probably programming 8 or 10 hours a day, he went on. By the time I was at Berkeley, I was doing it day and night. I had a terminal at home. I'd stay up until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning watching old movies and programming. Sometimes I'd fall asleep at the keyboard. He mimed his head falling onto the keyboard. And you know how the key repeats until the end and it starts to go beep, beep, beep? After that happens 3 times, you have to go to bed. I was still relatively incompetent even when I got to Berkeley. I was proficient by my second year there. That's when I wrote programs that are still in use today, 30 years later. He paused for a moment to do the math in his head, which, for someone like Bill Joy, doesn't take very long. Michigan in 1971. Programming in earnest by sophomore year. Add in the summers and the days and nights in his first year at Berkeley. It's 5 years, he said, finally. I didn't start the day I started at Michigan, so maybe 10,000 hours? That's about right. Is the 10,000-hour rule a general rule of success? If we scratch below the surface of every great achiever, do we always find the equivalent of the Michigan Computer Center or the hockey all-star team, some sort of special opportunity for practice? Let's test the idea with 2 examples. And for the sake of simplicity, let's make them as familiar as possible. The Beatles, one of the most famous rock bands ever, and Bill Gates, one of the world's richest men. The Beatles, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, came to the United States in February of 1964, starting the so-called British invasion of the American music scene and putting out a string of hit records that transformed the face of popular music. The first interesting thing about the Beatles, for our purposes, is how long they had already been together by the time they reached the United States. Lennon and McCartney first started playing together in 1957, 7 years prior to landing in America. Incidentally, the time that elapsed between their founding and their arguably greatest artistic achievements, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and the Beatles' White Album, is 10 years. And if you look even more closely at those long years of preparation, you'll find and experience that, in the context of hockey players and Bill Joy and world-class violinists, sounds awfully familiar. In 1960, while they were still a struggling high school rock band, the Beatles were invited to play in Hamburg, Germany. Hamburg in those days did not have rock and roll music clubs. It had strip clubs, says Philip Norman, who wrote the Beatles' biography, Shout. There was one particular club owner called Bruno, who was originally a fairground showman. He had the idea of bringing in rock groups to play in various clubs. They had this formula. It was a huge non-stop show, hour after hour, with a lot of people lurching in and the other lot lurching out. And the bands would play all the time to catch the passing traffic. In an American red light district, they would call it non-stop striptease. Many of the bands that played in Hamburg were from Liverpool, Norman went on. It was an accident. Bruno went to London to look for bands, but he happened to meet an entrepreneur from Liverpool in Soho who was down in London by pure chance, and he arranged to send some bands over. That's how the connection was established. And eventually, the Beatles made a connection not just with Bruno, but with other club owners as well. They kept going back because they got a lot of alcohol and a lot of sex. And what was so special about Hamburg? It wasn't that it paid well. It didn't. Or that the acoustics were fantastic. They weren't. Or that the audiences were savvy and appreciative. They were anything but. It was the sheer amount of time the band was forced to play. Here is John Lennon in an interview after the Beatles disbanded, talking about the band's performances at a Hamburg strip club called the Indra. We got better and got more confidence. We couldn't help it with all the experience playing all night long. It was handy, them being foreign. We had to try even harder, put our heart and soul into it to get ourselves over. In Liverpool, we'd only ever done 1-hour sessions, and we just used to do our best numbers, the same ones at every one. In Hamburg, we had to play for 8 hours, so we really had to find a new way of playing. 8 hours? Here is Pete Best, the Beatles' drummer at the time. Once the news got out about that we were making a show, the club started packing them in. We played 7 nights a week. At first, we played almost non-stop until 12:30 in the morning when it closed, but as we got better, the crowd stayed till 2 most mornings. 7 days a week? The Beatles ended up traveling to Hamburg 5 times between 1960 and the end of 1962. On the first trip, they played 106 nights, 5 or more hours a night. On their second trip, they played 92 times. On their third trip, they played 48 times for a total of 172 hours on stage. The last 2 Hamburg gigs in November and December of 1962 involved another 90 hours of performing. All told, they performed for 270 nights in just over a year and a half. By the time they had their first burst of success in 1964, in fact, they had performed live an estimated 1,200 times. Do you know how extraordinary that is? Most bands today don't perform 1,200 times in their entire careers. The Hamburg Crucible is one of the things that set the Beatles apart. They were no good on stage when they first went there, and they were very good when they came back, Norma went on. They learned not only stamina, they had to learn an enormous amount of numbers, cover versions of everything that you can think of. Not just rock and roll, a bit of jazz too. They weren't disciplined on stage before that, but when they came back, they sounded like no one else. It was the making of them. Let's now turn to the history of Bill Gates. His story is almost as well known as the Beatles. Brilliant young math whiz discovers computer programming, drops out of Harvard, starts a little computer company with his friends called Microsoft. Through sheer brilliance and ambition and guts, builds it into the giant of the software world. That's the broad outline. Now, let's dig a little bit deeper. Gates' father was a wealthy lawyer in Seattle, and his mother was the daughter of a well-to-do banker. As a child, Bill was precocious and easily bored by his studies. So his parents took him out of public school and at the beginning of 7th grade, sent him to Lakeside, a private school that catered to Seattle's elite families. Midway through Gates's second year at Lakeside, the school started a computer club. The Mothers Club at school did a rummage sale every year, and there was always the question of what the money would go to, Gates remembers. Some went to the summer program where inner-city kids would come up to the campus. Some of it would go for teachers. That year, they put $3,000 into a computer terminal down in this funny little room that we subsequently took control of. It was kind of an amazing thing. It was an amazing thing, of course, because this was 1968. Most colleges didn't have computer clubs in the 1960s. Even more remarkable was the kind of computer Lakeside bought. The school didn't have its students learn programming by the laborious computer card system like everyone else was doing in the 1960s. Instead, Lakeside installed what was called an ASR-33 teletype, which was a time-sharing terminal with a direct link to a mainframe computer in downtown Seattle. The whole idea of time-sharing only got started in 1965, Gates continued. Someone was pretty forward-looking. Bill Joy got an extraordinary early opportunity to learn programming on a timeshare system as a freshman in college in 1971. Bill Gates got to do real-time programming as an 8th grader in 1968. From that moment forward, Gates lived in the computer room. He and a number of others began to teach themselves how to use this strange new device. Buying time on the mainframe computer the ASR was hooked up to, of course, was expensive, even for a wealthy institution like Lakeside, and it wasn't long before the $3,000 put up by the Mothers Club ran out. Parents raised more money. Students spent it. Then a group of programmers at the University of Washington formed an outfit called Computer Center Corporation, or C-Cubed, which leased computer time to local companies. As luck would have it, one of the founders of the firm, Monique Rona, had a son at Lakeside, a class ahead of Gates. Would the Lakeside Computer Club, Rona wondered, like to test out the company's software programs on the weekends in exchange for free programming time? Absolutely. After school, Gates took the bus to the C-Cubed offices and programmed long into the evening. C-Cubed eventually went bankrupt, so Gates and his friends began hanging around the computer center at the University of Washington. Before long, they latched onto another outfit called ISI, which agreed to let them have free computer time in exchange for working on a piece of software that could be used to automate company payrolls. In one 7-month period in 1971, Gates and his cohorts ran up 1,575 hours of computer time on the ISI mainframe, which averages out to 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was my obsession, Gates says of his early high school years. I skipped athletics. I went up there at night. We were programming on weekends. It would be a rare week that we wouldn't get 20 or 30 hours in. There was a period where Paul Allen and I got in trouble for stealing a bunch of passwords and crashing the system. We got kicked out. I didn't get to use the computer the whole summer. This is when I was 15 and 16. Then I found out Paul had found a computer that was free at the University of Washington. They had these machines in the medical center and the physics department. They were on a 24-hour schedule, but with this big slack period, so that between 3 and 6 in the morning, they never scheduled anything. Gates laughed. I'd leave at night after my bedtime. I could walk up to the University of Washington from my house, or I'd take the bus. That's why I'm always so generous to the University of Washington, because they let me steal so much computer time. Years later, Gates's mother said, "We always wondered why it was so hard for him to get up in the morning." One of the founders of ISI, Bud Pembroke, then got a call from the technology company TRW, which had just signed a contract to set up a computer system at the huge Bonneville Power Station in southern Washington state. TRW desperately needed programmers familiar with the particular software the power station used. In these early days of the computer revolution, programmers with that kind of specialized experience were hard to find. But Pembroke knew exactly who to call. Those high school kids from Lakeside who had been running up thousands of hours of computer time on the ISI mainframe. Gates was now in his senior year, and somehow he managed to convince his teachers to let him decamp for Bonneville under the guise of an independent study project. There he spent the spring writing code under the direction of a man named John Norton, who Gates says taught him as much about programming as almost anyone else he'd ever met. Those 5 years, from 8th grade to the end of high school, were Bill Gates's Hamburg, and by any measure, he was presented with an even more extraordinary series of opportunities than Bill Joy. Opportunity number 1 was that Gates got sent to Lakeside. How many high schools in the world had access to a time-sharing terminal in 1968? Opportunity number 2 was that the mothers of Lakeside had enough money to pay for the school's computer fees. Number 3 was that when that money ran out, one of the parents happened to work at C-Cubed, which happened to need someone to check its code on the weekends, and which also happened not to care if weekends turned into weeknights. Number 4 was that Gates just happened to find out about ISI, and ISI just happened to need someone to work on its payroll software. And number 5 was that Gates happened to live within walking distance of the University of Washington, and number 6 was that the university happened to have free computer time between 3 and 6 in the morning. And number 7 was that TRW happened to call Bud Pembroke, and number 8 was that the best programmers Pembroke knew for that particular problem happened to be 2 high school kids. And number 9 was that Lakeside was willing to let those kids spend their spring term miles away writing code. And what did virtually all those opportunities have in common? They gave Bill Gates extra time to practice. By the time Gates dropped out of Harvard after his sophomore year to try his hand at his own software company, he'd been programming non-stop for 7 consecutive years. He was way past 10,000 hours. How many teenagers in the world had the kind of experience Gates had? If they were 50 in the world, I'd be stunned, he says. There was C-Cubed and the payroll stuff we did, then TRW. All those things came together. I had a better exposure to software development at a young age than I think anyone did in that period of time, and all because of an incredibly lucky series of events.
Okay, people, I tried to let you listen to it. You got to really be like doing something to zoned in to really listen to this whole thing, but I just wanted to prove some points. They talked about the Beatles. They talked about how they got in there 10,000 hours. They talked about Bill Joy, the founder of Sun Microsystems. They talked about Bill Gates. 10,000 hours is it just keeps popping up. But people will say the Beatles were lucky. Look, I'm not a big fan of the Beatles. I don't like their music at all. I probably can't name you but 2 or 3 songs that they did. But what I'm saying is, the Beatles are a classic example of the 10,000 hour rule, which is what that chapter is about. This next chapter is about the genius guy I spoke about in the other video I did about IQ. What's his name? Langham. Chris Langham. And guy has an IQ of 195. And say he records off the charts on some IQ test. Well, you know, Stephen Molyneux seems to think that IQ is the reason as to why black people are where they are. But as you will see in a second, that's not the case. What really makes a difference as to where you are speaks to what he talks about, which is practical intelligence. I'm going to put that in here. I'm going to let all that play out. I just want you guys to hear it. Check this out.
Actually, I'm going to break this up into 2 videos. So this is part 1. Part 2 is coming soon.